was sawn off. During the 1860s, Lister pioneered strict cleanliness in the operating theatre and stressed the importance of antiseptics. Slowly, others followed his lead. These changes in attitudes were gradual. Now, here we have poor people drinking water from the River Thames, which links us into this section here. This is Lord Lister, 1827 to 1912. It was perhaps the year of the Great Stink, 1858, which stirred Edwin Chadwick and others to demand action. In that year, the summer was particularly hot and little rain fell. The stench from the River Thames was so strong that in the House of Commons they had to cover the windows with curtains soaked in chloride of lime, and anyone crossing Westminster Bridge had to hold something over his nose and mouth. Men like Charles Dickens and Charles Kingsley attacked the widespread ignorance, stupidity and stinginess in matters of public health. Kingsley wrote that in Bermondsey people had no water to drink except from the common sewer. It was only after the experiences of the Great Stink and numerous outbreaks of cholera that people began to recognise the connection between dirt and disease. Action followed later, when London got a proper drainage system with magnificent sewers beneath the streets. Disraeli, the Prime Minister of the day, was aware of the great contrasts in living conditions. He thought that England was divided into two nations, the rich men about town, dandies, and people living on near starvation wages in horrible conditions, drudges. In 1874 and 1875, Acts were passed to help factory workers and to improve public health. A whole range of social services which we take for granted today came into being. Horrible housing conditions and starvation were still causing some concern, but social progress was nevertheless slowly being achieved, and without the bloodshed that accompanied it in other countries in Europe during this period. those days, official entertainments were usually held at Windsor Castle. There were few spectacles so imposing as the great Waterloo banqueting hall, crowded with men wearing multicoloured uniforms and women dazzling in their diamonds. Stately portraits decorated the walls. The tables were loaded with gold plates. In the midst of this official splendour, there on occasions included visits from the King of Prussia, King Louis Philippe of France, and the King of Saxony. The most outstanding personality was the Queen, the little wife who had been walking with her children that morning, who had practised the piano, written up her diary, and inspected her livestock, now shone forth and impressed her distinguished guests. On such occasions, indeed on all occasions, the Queen stuck closely to court rules and behaviour. No one was allowed to speak out of turn, and if anyone dared to take any sort of liberty in conversation at the dinner table, they would receive a crushing reproof. "We are not amused," the Queen was heard to say, when a particular remark displeased her. At their other residence, Osborne House, on the Isle of Wight, which is here, the Prince of Wales, or Bertie, was once late for dinner, through no fault of his own. It is said that he stood behind a pillar, wiping the sweat from his face, as he plucked up enough courage to apologise to his mother. When at last he did so, she gave him a curt nod, and he then vanished behind another pillar and stayed there until dinner was over. On this occasion, he was 50 years old. Osborne House was another home which was designed for Victoria by her beloved Albert. The royal children had a wonderful playground there, with a Swiss cottage for the boys to learn carpentry, and the girls' cookery and housekeeping. The furniture was all made small enough for children, and the Queen and Prince Albert were sometimes invited to tea there. After the end of the Crimean War in 1856, life at court was not quite so jolly or easy. Princess Vicky married the Crown Prince of Prussia and went to live abroad, and Victoria's mother, the Duchess of Kent, died in 1861. The Queen was so upset that Albert had to beg her to pull herself together and lead a normal life. Now this is a picture of Windsor Castle at the bottom. At this time, Albert himself was showing signs of severe strain. He never really relaxed, and daily prepared outlines of letters and government documents for the Queen to see. On top of this, he took an active interest in everything that was going on, and supervised the royal households and estates, and his health suffered in consequence. When he caught a chill in November 1861, no one was particularly alarmed. Lord Palmerston suggested a further medical opinion, but was overruled. 2 other doctors were at last called in, and found that the prince had typhoid fever. The possibility of his death was real. In the middle of December, his children were sent for to see him for the last time before he died. Albert died to the sound of hymns being played on a piano in the next room. It is said that Victoria uttered a shriek of such pain and anguish that it was never forgotten by those who heard it. The Queen's grief was overwhelming, and it swamped her life for many years. According to the historian Lytton Strachey, for 40 years after his death, the prince's rooms at Windsor were kept as if he were still alive. His clothing was laid out each day, and water set ready in the wash basin for him each evening. Now, she tried to cling to the past and to recapture it. Victoria, in fact, never threw away any of her possessions. All her dresses, muffs, parasols, bonnets and dolls were carefully put away in drawers. Each article was photographed before it was put away, and the photograph put in an album with a note of where the article had been put. So that the memory of Prince Albert would not fade, Victoria had statues put up all over the country and his speeches published. Yet apart from Disraeli and a few others, it seemed that no one really appreciated her dear Albert. Now this picture shows when the Queen returned to Balmoral in 1862, the summer after Albert's death. Her first visit was to a widow of a cottager on the estate. Both burst into tears at the memory of their recent losses, and Victoria said she was thankful to cry with someone who knew exactly how she felt. Victoria withdrew more and more from public life and became so remote from the affairs of the country that for a time there was considerable resentment after she seemed to be failing the nation in her duties as Queen. What does she do with it? £385,000 a year was the title of one pamphlet attacking her. Her private fortune was said to be £5 million, but the monarch's wealth has always remained a close secret even today. One consequence of her retirement from public life and affairs of state was that, whereas up to the time of Albert's death the power of the Crown had increased, afterwards, under the Prime Ministers Gladstone, Disraeli and Lord Salisbury, this power effectively declined. The Queen, however, was instrumental in putting an end to one of the privileges enjoyed by the wealthy classes. When Gladstone decided to stop the purchase of military commissions, the House of Lords bitterly opposed him. So he asked the Queen to make the Act law by royal warrant, and she readily agreed. She also gave her name to the highest award for bravery, the Victoria Cross. Unlike most military medals, it is awarded entirely without regard to rank. It is given simply for bravery. It was perhaps at Balmoral that Victoria could most easily remember and dwell on those happier days when Albert was around, especially as John Brown was there. He had been Albert's personal attendant in Scotland. Now he became more a constant companion than just a servant to the Queen. And here he is down here. There's Victoria. Balmoral in the background. And on this side we have the three Prime Ministers: W.E. Gladstone, Benjamin Disraeli, Lord Salisbury, and this is the Victoria Cross. Many stories are told about John Brown's outspoken manner and his special place in the Queen's household. One day, when Victoria was sketching at Glassholt Shield, a small lodge not far from Balmoral, she was unable to find a table of just the right height for her drawing board. Every table in the lodge had been tried, but none would do. At last, John Brown grabbed the first table he could reach among the many already rejected, and placing it before the Queen said, "The folk canna make one for you." The Queen merely laughed, and accepting the position, made use of the table. At Balmoral too, she kept up the custom of listening to the bagpipes played under her window every morning from 8 to 9 o'clock. Although Victoria was sharply and publicly criticised for hiding away, her critics gradually fell silent stick in London. The critical attitude towards the Queen changed most noticeably from November 1871, when the Prince of Wales became dangerously ill with typhoid fever. It was the 10th anniversary of Albert's death, and he had died of typhoid. Then Bertie made a sudden recovery, and a wave of popular sympathy swept the country. So in this picture we have one of London's first trams, and this shows how a revolver was fired at the Queen in an attempt on her life. There's policemen in the background. In 1876, this little old lady, with her short, stout figure in folds of black velvet, muslin streamers, heavy pearls, and a haughty look, became Empress of India. Her personal prestige and popularity were assured, and the monarchy took on a new look. As an institution, it became more strongly established, even if it lost actual political power in the long run. There was a further attempt on Victoria's life. In 1882, Roderick Maclean fired at her as she was entering her carriage. He was sent to a lunatic asylum. That's the picture that we just saw. The two main landmarks in the development of the new look of the monarchy were the Golden Jubilee of 1887 and the Diamond Jubilee of 1897. The first occasion demanded a strenuous programme of public appearances. When Victoria opened the People's Palace, she drove from Paddington to Whitechapel through streets lined with cheering crowds. On May the 22nd, London was illuminated when there was a special service in St Margaret's, Westminster. May the 24th was the Queen's birthday. Then came the high point of the year, the Thanksgiving service in Westminster Abbey. There was a state procession up Constitution Hill, along Piccadilly and the Embankment to the Abbey. In the procession there were kings from Denmark, Belgium and Saxony. There were crown princes and grand dukes. There was also a special bodyguard of 18 princes, among whom were 3 sons and 9 grandsons and grandsons-in-law of the sovereign. So in this picture we have the first London telephone exchange about 1878, and various famous faces from the time. This is David Livingstone, the explorer. next 2 years were comparatively uneventful for Victoria. Her health remained good, and she went abroad for holidays as usual. In May 1899, she laid the foundation stone of the new buildings, completing the Victoria and Albert Museum. That project, planned by Albert more than 40 years before. Then came the anxieties of the Boer War, which proved much more serious than anybody expected. The Queen showed a watchful interest in the course of the campaign. She reviewed the departing regiments and entertained the wives and children of the Windsor soldiers who had gone to the war. She sent a Christmas gift of a box of chocolates to every soldier in South Africa. She also visited Piper, Findlater, and Private Vickery in hospital, and decorated them with a Victoria Cross for bravery in the Boer War. In 1900, Victoria decided to visit Ireland, a land of revolution, violence and unrest.